If love is such a universal good, then why does it inspire such cruelty? Welcome, my mere mortalites, to another round of the Mere Mortals book reviews. My name is Kyrin, a host of the Mere Mortals podcast, but also the host of this podcast, who dives deep into the books that we're reading to look at some of the reviews, some of the themes, some of the deep stuff that we can get out of it. And today we have Madame Bovary by Gustave Flaubert, the French author. So this was published in 1856 originally. So what's that? That's a century and a bit, almost getting close to 2 centuries. And it's about 300 pages in length. So it's not a super, super thick book. It's the provincial tale set in, I'm going to pronounce some names wrong here, Rouen, R-O-U-E-N, France, during the 19th century, so the same time that this book was published. And we are privy to the intimate affairs of Emma, who is also known as Madame Bovary. And basically, the book starts off looking at her husband's life, actually. So Charles Bovary, it grows up with his sort of living his sort of insipid, not amazing life, but you know, he's a regular guy, I guess you'd say. And he has some, heartbreaks. He marries a lady, she dies, and he's a widow, and he ends up marrying Emma, who is the daughter of a farmer. And basically then we start to see her marriage with him, her sort of the contrast between her love for him and his love for her. And so her love is kind of disillusioned. She isn't particularly enjoying it, whereas he thinks he has like, wow, this is the best life ever. This is amazing. And we sort of see these two contrasts, and this begins a downward spiral for her. And with some brief highs, so she has some, I wouldn't say high profile affairs, but she has an affair or two outside of her marriage. And it ends with a relatively sad ending, which I won't spoil here. Now, this, touching upon the author and the work itself, it was somewhat controversial and very influential at the time. So it was somewhat of a groundbreaking literary style. Literary realism was what it was called by Gustave Flaubert. He was a pretty prolific author. He wrote quite a few things. And the book itself was scandalous at the time, but also recognized as being brilliant. And after, I believe there was a court case or something like that, and he got free rein to publish the work and for it to be produced en masse. It was highly accepted and very well known, and even to this day, it's somewhat acclaimed as being unique for its style, and I'll get into that in a little bit. In terms of the scandalous nature, nowadays it's pretty tame. There's nothing too much scandalous about it, but you can imagine somewhat at the time why this might have been. And we'll go on to the first theme that I took out of this, which was blind desire, the cause of ecstasy, and immense suffering as well. And I wanted to approach this topic by looking at a relatively simple question. What is love? Okay, so it's not so simple, but what is love for Madame Bovary and also for Charles? And for her, it's somewhat triggered by her imagination. So we learn earlier in the book, she used to be in a convent, and she would read these, love tales that were sort of secretly smuggled in that the nuns didn't know about, and these caused, powerful fantasies and imaginations for her. She was had a very vivid mind of what love should be like and what love should be like for her as well. And so she somewhat creates this fantasy that just it's probably never going to be fulfilled, to be honest. And there's one scene in particular where she's I think somewhat having her affairs, but they're not going particularly swimmingly well. Her life at home she detests and hates, and she has this scene where she imagines the perfect lover in her head, and it's not concrete. It's sort of this amalgamation of all of these things that she thinks she'd like, a powerful man, but not too powerful. He should be handsome, but also only for her. She's the only one for him, and it's somewhat blurry. It's not a concrete vision of what she wants. And I think this starts to get into, okay, like why, what does she really thinking about in her head? What has she really inspected what she wants? And it's almost like there's not really that much introspection on her part, and nor I suppose like the tampering down of what is actually realistic, what can be achieved in this world that we live in. And so for her, it's all pretty much externally driven in terms of her love and her happiness. You can see there's this external locus of control. So there's no ability for her to change her own internal mindset to adjust to her situation. No, it's always like, this person has to do this for me, or this event is happening, and she will get into debt and just sort of brush it off and be like, oh, that's another person's problem. It's not me, caused by me and my prolific spending and my being manipulated by this merchant who was selling me these things and saying, oh, just get a promissory note, just put yourself in a little bit of debt, it's fine, you'll pay it off eventually. No, it's always someone else's problem somewhat. She doesn't take responsibility for her own actions. So it's very extremely selfish, and you can imagine that it's very hard to make herself happy. So there's no internal locus of control of being like, oh, I'm going to look inwards. Okay, maybe I don't particularly love my husband. Maybe, this child that I have, I don't feel a particular love for. But what are the small joys in life that I could focus on? How can I make myself happy given the constraints of the world I live in? So she doesn't do much of that, and neither does Charles, to be honest. But we'll look at his in a little bit. Now, there's not too much time. There's too much time and not enough distractions, perhaps. So this is perhaps looking at her situation and going, was this sort of blind desire, was this, I guess, the cause of her ecstasy and immense suffering caused by her imaginations, by her fantasies? And you can see that in the lifestyle that she leads, there's not really a whole lot for her to do. She's got what I would call a middle-class husband. He's a doctor, but he's not a famous doctor. And they live in somewhat I guess you'd say the outer suburbs of France, like in the countryside. And you can see that they're wealthy enough to have a maid, so she doesn't particularly need to do the cleaning around the house. She really wants for nothing apart from that which she can't have, which is immense riches and a palace and fawning adoration and jewels and whatnot. She gets a taste of this once in the book, where she visits this wealthy estate owner, I believe, and who invites her, and they go to this grand ball and they stay overnight and they stay in a mansion, and she gets a taste of all of this, but she cannot realize this for herself. There's no way of this actually ever happening. And you can just see, in her time in the convent, she spent a lot of time just idling around doing nothing. And this, was where she started to get her fantasies. When she was at home under her father's control and working in the farm, once again, she had work to do, but it wasn't fulfilling. It wasn't something that was a passion for her or in her life or something. When she marries Charles, once again, she's this sort of domestic housewife. She just has too much time, almost, perhaps. And this is where you start to think, oh, okay, maybe this is somewhat the cause of her unhappiness. It's just she has nothing to do. If you have absolutely nothing to do and no passion, then you kind of screwed, and you will create passions for yourself, and these might not be the best of passions. So there's many what ifs as well that sort of come out of this, and you go, okay, what if her blind desires could have been fulfilled? What if she had been courted by the Viscount, for example, who was this wealthy guy she met at this grand gala, this ball, and what if he'd courted her and taken her away? What if she'd run away with Rodolphe, which was one of her lovers and who had promised her this life and then pulled out at the last minute? What if she had, just gone with Leon as well, example, or he had behaved in the way that she thought a lover should behave? And this is where I start to think, okay, she might have had brief glimpses, maybe a year of happiness again, but it seemed like she would always become discontented. It seemed like there was no way for her to achieve a stability in her life of happiness and of her love to continue at the same intensity. Sort of like the story of Icarus. She flew too close to the sun. She experienced that high, that joy, got taken away, and this would always inevitably lead to her downfall, perhaps. Now, the other theme which I want to jump onto is ignorant contentment, and so this is not a solid base for a good or even a great life. And if we look at Charles, who is somewhat her opposite in many ways, he seems to have a really even temperament. He also seems to be relatively ignorant of what's really going on in his wife's mind inside of her, because we see in the book that she's very severely discontented. She has these fits. There's times where she can't stand him and she has to run out of the room or abuses him verbally and things like this. And he's sort of the buffoon, just going, oh, but I just want to please her. I just want to do everything I can to her, which is, somewhat noble in a way. You could say he's got a great heart, but unfortunately he doesn't have the mind to back it up and to be able to change with a situation. So he's got a simple love, but he's very unaware. He didn't want much. When he married her for the first time, he was content. He was happy. He had a somewhat not thriving, but a solid, clientele for his medical work, which he would go out to their estates and help them out and to their villages or whatnot. He had a nice little house, a nice little wife, a nice little life, but there was no great ambitions, and it seemed like she wanted this for him, but he would never be able to do this for himself. And she hates him for it, and it just grows and grows and grows and grows, and he is somewhat unaware of this. And it almost seemed like both of them lack understanding in a way. This is sort of the common theme, I guess, I'd take out of this, which is the blind desire and ignorant contentment. It's the lack of communication. Neither of them expressed to the other what they were feeling, what they were thinking about, what their internal motivations were. Neither of them particularly cared for the other, from what I could tell. Charles didn't care enough for her to really investigate why she was unhappy. It would sort of just be, she's unhappy. Maybe I should take her for a trip somewhere. Maybe I should do this. Like, he didn't bother to really try and get to the intimate details and figure it out. And they both just lacked understanding of each other and of her. So I think he understood himself well enough, because there was not much to understand. He was a relatively simple character, but she was immensely complex with these huge highs, these burning desires, these ambitions. And maybe if he'd spent the time to really figure this out, either before the marriage or even after it, the sad ending that occurs, where the sort of both of them come to ruin in their family, and their daughter comes to wreck and ruin as well, maybe all of that could have been avoided, perhaps. So those are the couple of themes that I really took away from this book. Some observations and takeaways. I would wonder if that the diagnosis of bipolar disorder had been around in that time, whether she would have been diagnosed with that, because she just seemed to have this... It seemed to me to have some of the characteristics of that, which is, the immense highs, the immense lows, the eventual, spoilers here, the eventual suicide that she commits upon herself is pretty characteristic of people with bipolar, sadly enough. And yeah, it's just intriguing to go like, would this tale have happened in the modern day? Because perhaps she would have, been able to take lithium, for example, and this could have dampened down some of the wildness that was definitely within her. Funnily enough, reading the book as well as just the people in general, everyone seemed nice enough on the surface, but when you find the final outcomes out of how everyone does, it's almost like, man, they're not particularly pleasant deep down. Like, all of them seem to have a little bit of conniving in them. The pharmacist, for example, who's helping them out, but is secretly in competition and somewhat destroys Charles's reputation by convincing him to do this dangerous surgery on a man who has a club foot. There's the merchant who I already talked about, who was manipulating Emma, Madame Bovary, into buying stuff she didn't need, putting her into debt unnecessarily. Both of her lovers, somewhat. Rodolphe, from the very get-go, was manipulating her and not being true about his love for her, which was more lust than anything else. And even Leon, for example, when push came to shove, wasn't willing to help her out. A probably good decision. He was probably actually the most somewhat normal and well put together character of the whole book. And it's funny to just look at this and look at the personalities that they had, and it was relatively simple. And I'd actually contrast this with a book like The Idiot, where there was probably a similar amount of characters, even though it was a much shorter book. But the characters were much more easy to remember, and they didn't intrude in upon at different times. The flow of them, they were a bit more distinct in a way almost. Whereas those in The Idiot would just be like, oh, geez, which character is this popping up now? Perhaps that has to do with the naming system, which is very hard in Russian. And the other factor could just be the style. So the style in this book is I would say truly unique. You know what? I've read a fair few books, but this is probably one that sticks out for its. I'm going to say small details that give depth. So we talked about how this was one of the first of literary realism, and it really did feel like that. It felt like this was what perhaps even a reporter would have been like at the time, saying, okay, the fair, for example, there's an annual fair which has to do with the produce and sort of the agricultural farmers and things like this. And as he's describing it, he gives just immense details of the tiny little touches of someone coughs here when someone is speaking and to the audience, the way the soldiers and the sort of mishazzard sloppiness of the provincial farmers who are acting like soldiers, for example, and all of these tiny little details which occurs all throughout the book in every single scene. It's not straight communication. It's he really fleshes out almost everything. Now, this can go wrong. You can have overly detailed, and it gets boring, and it's like, oh, geez, how does I don't care about the minutiae of the caterpillars on the trees eating the leaves and what's going on internally in the caterpillar's mind, and which doesn't occur in this book, by the way, just an example. But this one, I think, captures that right blend of moving the plot forward and having the characters interact with each other, but also building the scene, the setting that it was all created in, and what life would have felt like in the 19th century provincial France. So very, very cool. I can see why this book is acclaimed for having this sort of uniqueness to it. So I'm going to go on to the summary, and I'll just say, women and love can combine for some tragedy. The depth to the potential relationships and not looking at one sources of happiness, I think, is what I really took out from this book. The style is unique and definitely memorable for this alone. Just the way that he describes the scenery and the interactions to the people. I really enjoyed that. I thought that was very cool. I wouldn't say I was captivated by the people or the plot line, for example. It is relatively simple. A woman has two affairs, and her oblivious husband is somewhat taken aback by this right at the very end when he learns about this. So there's not too much drama, for example. There's no real conflict in the novel. It all sort of just peters out right towards the end, the last 30 pages or so. So I didn't captivate me for this, but I did recognize a great book for what it is. Very, very solid. So overall, I'm going to give Madame Bovary by Gustave Flaubert a 7 out of 10. Very solid book. And I think we'll end it for there today. So what are your thoughts, my mere mortalites, on the the book of Madame Bovary of Gustave Flaubert. Have you read any of the French literature from the 19th century or any of his works in particular? I'd love to know all of these things in the comments if you wanted to leave one. And then I'd also just highlight that this is also an audio podcast. And so all of the pictures and things that you're seeing on the screen as this has been occurring, you can also get in a very good podcast app, newpodcastapps.com. Just choose whichever one you want from there. And you get a feel for what it'd be like to listen to this if you just don't want to particularly view the video. So you can sort of have this viewing pleasure at any time you want without any bandwidth or any concerns like that. So really do hope you're having a provincial day, perhaps, wherever you are in the world. Kyrin out.